Profound thing that I think has been said during this retreat that I have heard was when Mitch said that the more you love, the more love you are given. When my daughter and my wife came to me and said, "We want you to adopt a boy," I resisted. As I look back, I'm incredulous and embarrassed that I resisted. I mean, what father would resist having a son? You know, perhaps it points to some unresolved problems of my own childhood. Because I grew up, my dad was a tough guy. He was a good guy, but he was tough. Perhaps I was feeling older, middle-aged, and that I was through with those kind of things. That I'd been through it. Perhaps I felt I worked too hard and this would be just more work. But you know, the moment we saw the face of Cyprian sent to us on email from Romania, a spark flew inside of me. I felt younger just seeing his face. I felt I had reservoirs of energy I didn't know about. I responded to his face. And then when we went to Bucharest for the week in July of 2001, and we were ushered into the room of the foster family he had been staying with for a month. And he came out with his foster father waking up from a nap. You know, as the poets say, my heart leapt. A psalmist. And for the first few minutes, he was not responding. We tried to give him a bear. He didn't like the bear.
Smart kid.
And I mean, he showed very good sense, even at an early age. But then there was this red balloon, and my daughter kind of spontaneously hit it toward him, and he hit it back. And at that moment, he became part of the family. He responded. And his presence in the life of our family, and I know that this has been at the core of what Mitch has been saying, but I'm attesting to it. And it's right at the heart of what I want to say about happiness today, about why happiness is a passion. I feel like I've grown younger since he's been in our family. I certainly act it. My daughter has discovered what it is to fight with a sibling, to fight with a brother. She would have been deprived of that. And my wife is even more of a hero than I ever thought, because now we're dealing with this institutionally created autism, and we're into that whole years and years of therapy. But he'll be fine. So the love that we have discovered through Cyprian is because his presence in our lives acted upon us and brought something out. That's what a passion is. A passion is being acted upon. Here we go, Latin and Greek again. Pathos means being acted upon, being passive to something. When you have a great passion, it means something has hit you in the gut and has moved you, and it makes you feel, and it makes you think, and it makes you desire, but it all because something bumped into you. Now, philosophically, that's contrasted with the word action or activity. Passion, activity, active, passive. And here, I think, is where the Christian view of happiness is fundamentally, metaphysically different, Dr. Shaw, metaphysically different from philosophical, even Aristotelian notions of happiness. Because Aristotle defined happiness as activity in accordance with virtue. Write that down. Activity in accordance with virtue. It may have slipped out in my sleep. Activity meaning virtuous action. Action. And the reason Aristotle insisted on the word activity was he was trying to distinguish his view from the pre-philosophical views of happiness, which said happiness is luck or fortune, that it's something that just occurs. But how can happiness, in the context of the Christian universe, be simply a human activity when our happiness is so much dependent on what has happened to us and what must happen to us, how we must be acted upon in order to achieve our ultimate end? I know that we haven't talked much about movies because movies are shown on television. But one very fine movie that illustrates this point is the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams. How many of you saw that movie? Robin Williams plays a doctor working with patients who suffered from childhood encephalitis, who are essentially walking around in vegetative states. Now, this is also based upon a book by a medical doctor named Oliver Sacks. And no one has ever, in this hospital, this is a true story, by the way, no one's ever been able to get these patients to do anything, to respond. Until one day the doctor just throws one of the patients a ball, and all of a sudden his hands spring up and he catches the ball. And so he begins to do therapy by throwing balls at the patients, and they've been sitting there for years unresponsive. They just start catching the ball. And the doctor describes the patients as taking the will of the ball. Taking the will of the ball. Meaning that the presence of this external object acted upon them and sprung them to action. Like Cyprian springing me to action, or the green balloon springing him to action. In fact, Dr. Sacks describes the whole phenomenon. His patients had suddenly fallen in love with reality. And what was bringing them out of their state was a sudden glimpse of the reality they had been cut off from for so long. You see, I think there's a philosophic, apologetic possibility for us in trying to get people to see real happiness. In other words, we can try to get people to respond to reality as it really is, reality as it is given to us. Nobody's going to disagree, nobody's, I think, going to argue with you that they chose to come into existence. Although I think Shirley MacLaine has done that. I don't think anyone's going to seriously argue with you that they created their own nature, their own, what it means to be a human being. I mean, that's given as well. The existence, the nature. And once you meditate at all on this curious and unique fact that you exist rather than not exist, some pretty remarkable things that can happen. Philosopher Jacques Maritain talks about having the intuition of being. Now, philosophers argue about whether that happens. I think it happens. I think probably those of you that live closer to nature than I do have it more often. An intuition that these things that are in the world don't have to be. They're not necessary. Everything that is might not have been. I remember one time I was horse wrestling with my wife, just playing around. And I threw myself at her. She was lying. I threw myself. I was going to pretend I was going to fall on her, you know. And as I was coming down, I had this sudden intuition that she might not have existed ever. And at that moment I thought, nothing needs to be. Because God didn't create out of necessity. God created out of choice. Now, meditate on that long enough. Put that close to your heart. And you become very grateful. You become even reverent. You have piety toward existence. And that's a kind of pre-theological moment that people can begin to see happiness in the light of creation. But that's only the first step in seeing all the things that act upon us. As Christians, we know that we can't live good lives without the help of God's grace. I know that Dr. Carlson has been talking about Augustine and Augustine's famous set of distinctions. I think it's in Book 9 of the Confessions, where in philosophy I saw the Word, but in Scriptures I saw the Word made flesh. In philosophy I saw the way I should live, but in Scripture I saw that there was a power going to be given to me to actually live the life as opposed to just know what the life is. And all these descriptions between what reason can comprehend, but what grace actually enables us to do. The way it adds power to the will to act. So we have to be acted upon, Kyle, even to live well. Now, when we die and go to heaven, we are brought into the presence of God to eternally enjoy His vision. Now, do you think that our finite minds are big enough to take in God face to face? No, so something has to happen. We have to be acted upon again. We have to receive something again. I've already talked about receivables, creation, nature, grace in the moral life. We have another receivable. It's called the light of glory. The light of glory is that moment when God illumines our mind in heaven elevates it to a level where we can know Him. So in other words, God gives us the power even in heaven to reach full happiness. Otherwise, our minds wouldn't be able to see Him. So even in heaven, God's acting upon us. Even in heaven, God is giving us the power to receive happiness. So I submit, my friends, that happiness is a passion. Yes, there's action that is necessary in response. We must act to be virtuous. We must act to both own and enjoy the other goods of life. But without that which we receive, we'd be nowhere. Now, I've been asked numerous times in the last few days, what does this have to do with joy? And God bless Kyle for standing up last night and saying, all I hear about is emotions. I mean, it does my heart good to hear somebody his age complaining about that. Because they ought to be complaining about it. Because they're the losers in this generation that's only been taught about feelings. And let's start learning about what they really are. Let's not be impatient with the distinction I'm about to make. I'm going to make a distinction. I'm going to tell you what joy is not and what it is. And I want you to accept the distinction and not dismiss it as some kind of abstraction. Because it's important for everybody in this room to know. It keeps you from making mistakes. It makes you a better teacher. I remember when I was at Fordham and I used to have lunch with Avery Dulles, Cardinal Dulles, in the Jesuit residence. And at that time he was writing his wonderful book on faith. And he said, Deal, the reason I'm writing this book is because people talk about faith like it's a feeling. They've forgotten that it's a virtue of the intellect. They've just forgotten. Faith can't be a feeling because feelings do not possess or convey knowledge. So how can faith be a feeling? Come on. Why do we even utter a creed? Why don't we just all squeal? You know? Squeal with pleasure at the moment someone says credo. We can just skip the words altogether. Joy is very simply the byproduct of any kind of attainment. Anytime you desire something and then possess it, you will enjoy it. You will delight in it. There will be a satisfaction. So we have enjoyment at all levels. We enjoy friends, we enjoy family, we are in joy, we enjoy knowledge, we enjoy worship, prayer. But of course, the kind of joy that you're asking me about is the deepest joy, the most significant joy, the joy of a life united with God. Now, why isn't that the happy life itself? Why can't joy be a synonym for happiness? The reason it can't be a synonym is because the happiness is the life. It is the living of the life, the kind of the life. The byproduct that belongs to that life, but is not the happiness itself, is the enjoyment in the life, the delight in the life, the satisfaction in the life. Now, I think the best way to illustrate that, why that distinction has to be maintain is Paul's notion that we joy in our sufferings. Because if we joy in our sufferings, then it illustrates that even the joy that Paul talks about isn't really a feeling at all. It's, because if you're being burned at the stake, or you're howling from the bull of Phalaris, or if you're Christ being scourged, by the way, that movie's being shown twice today, 10 o'clock in Houston, 3 o'clock in Dallas, to more groups of people. And the bishops are going.
Which one?
Oh, Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion. Sorry. I was thinking of, when I think of scourging now, I can't help but think of that movie.
Do you know when it's coming out?
Ash Wednesday, 2003. How do you have joy in suffering? Well, it's the joy. If you're being persecuted for Christ's sake, you can know why you're accepting the suffering for God, for the church, and be thankful that this is happening. Delight in your union with God at that time and your identification with Christ. Now that's no more than a psychological satisfaction, but of the highest order. Of the highest order, because it's the byproduct of martyrdom. But it is not synonymous with the martyrdom. And as I said a couple of days ago, if there is no joy in the suffering, then something is missing from the happiness. But it is the foundation. Now, what is it that people actually accomplish when they teach emotions? Can emotions be taught? As you know, this is something that I think is a problem. I think it's something that needs to stop. But I think one way to convince people to stop it is to show that to teach emotions subverts emotions themselves. When you teach people to look for emotions, you're destroying their emotional life. You're making their emotional life less rich. Let me prove it to you. And this is Aristotle's point, by the way. His point is very simple, and it's a common sense point that you've seen played out thousands of times in your lives. When you approach an activity or any action with the consciousness of enjoying it, that's your primary motivation, you will be less likely to enjoy it, and you may be spoiling the enjoyment by expecting it. The way you enjoy something is to immerse yourself in the activity for the sake of the activity, and then all of a sudden the joy, the emotion, the good feelings arise out of it unexpectedly. Now, let's think of a concrete example. Let's say a lecture of Bob Carlson's. Let's say that you're on the way with your books under your arm to a lecture of Bob Carlson at Casper College. Am I going to enjoy this? Is this going to be fun? Is he going to boring me? Well, if you're worried about your emotional state at Carlson's lecture, you're very likely to be bored unless Carlson overcomes your attitude. But if you're going to Carlson's lecture thinking, I'm really interested in this text, in Augustine, in learning about him, I'm ready to pay attention, I've read my material, then all of a sudden in the middle of the class you find yourself smiling, you find yourself energized, your eyes are open, and you're enjoying it, and you're surprised. Hey, I'm enjoying this. But that happens to people all the time. I mean, hedonists, true hedonists, who live their lives looking for pleasure, end up in misery. I mean, if you've ever read the life of the Marquis de Sade, for example, who did nothing but pursue heightened and intensified states of pleasure, ended up in perversion, ended up in cruelty, ended up wrecking and ruining his life and the life of everybody he met. See, the irony is for Christians to teach chasing after emotions is extremely destructive and amazingly out of touch with the history of any reflection on emotions anyway. I don't get it. C.S. Lewis put it best when he said he was surprised by joy. He was surprised by joy. The greatest joys are those that surprise you. So let's get over the attitude in the morning of, am I going to enjoy the day? Let's get out of the attitude when we go to church, am I going to enjoy this? Let's immerse ourselves in the activities of life, immerse ourselves in serving others and serving God, and let's be surprised by the fact that we are in fact visited by joy in the midst of it. As I said, responsiveness to creation, responsiveness to the isness of life is at the heart, I think, of the receptivity or the passion of happiness that I want to emphasize in way of concluding these series of lectures on happiness. As Father Bob said earlier in one of his homilies, great self-definition of Yahweh God in the book of Exodus is when he said to Moses, I am who I am, or I am that I am. What does that mean? It means that there is one being in reality who is existence itself without any qualifications. Existence without any limitation of a nature. One being in the whole of reality who necessarily exists, whose existence is not an accident, whose existence precedes us, who is never acted upon, whose being does not need anything else. You know, there's this wonderful book from the 30s called The Chain of Being by Arthur Lovejoy. The chain of being is a metaphor that was devised probably in the Middle Ages earlier by Dionysius the Areopagite or somebody like that. So basically trying to catch the idea that all of created being, from the angels down to us, all created being is dependent on each other, and that it's united. The angels that surround us protect us. The lowest level, the minerals in the ground, the vegetables, the animals, and I'm not talking about me. we depend upon for life. Each other. We are not isolated monads. We are not rugged individualists in any sense. We depend on one another for life. The idea that somehow our good lives, our happy lives, are simply a product of our action and not a product of what we receive, what is a gift, what is beyond the self, is ridiculous. That's why happiness as self-satisfaction is so pernicious. Think about it. I hope you see how the idea, the problems with self-satisfaction are much clearer to you now than they were the first day we started talking about it. Because if you pursue self-satisfaction as your happiness, you cut yourself off from the whole schema of human happiness. Self-satisfaction, you didn't create yourself. Self-satisfaction, you didn't create your own nature. Self-satisfaction, you don't decide upon what the virtues are. They arise out of what kind of being you are. Self-satisfaction, you don't have the power to be good. It comes from God. Self-satisfaction, you don't rise yourself to heaven. Self-satisfaction, you don't give yourself the light of glory that raises the power of your intellect to see God. Self-satisfaction, you didn't create the rocks, the trees, the flowers, the bees. You didn't create any of this stuff. Self-satisfaction? In what? In fact, I think that Mick Jagger is right. We can't get no satisfaction. We really can't. We have a sacred discontent built into our existence. Now, in the Summa Theologia, Aquinas describes Satan's fall from heaven, Lucifer's fall from heaven, as a turning away from happiness. What did he turn toward? Self-satisfaction. I mean, Lucifer was the first positive thinker. He was the first self-help guru. Dare I say it, the first therapist. No, I'm sorry. That's it. No. Sorry. She's been after me for days. I haven't. Now, all right, now. Now, any of you that have been through therapy, good therapy, know that good therapists take you through hell to get to happiness. Good therapists say to you, you know what, there's some pain you're running from. You need to do like Virgil did and go down to Hades. You need to do like Dante did and start in the Inferno. Because you're not going to get to happiness till you walk through and get very acquainted with all those unrecognized demons inside of you. And if you keep running away from them, those demons are just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So good therapy, you see the irony of this whole business of psychological happiness is that most of what you see in the self-help section about happiness doesn't reflect the work that good psychological therapists do. Because good psychological therapists don't flatter you, don't accept your self-deceptions, don't let you BS them yourself. You have to get real. And so the irony is, as far as I can tell, that wisdom of that profession is not reflected in the popular versions of the books they write. Now, I think there's a very good reason for that, because I've written one, not popular one. I still think I'm going to do it one day, but every time I get around to trying to write it, I'm stopped. I get offers once a year. We want you to rewrite your book for the general public. And I'm stopped by one difficulty. How do I tell people who are interested in happiness that they have to suffer? Who's going to buy that book? I'm serious. You might, because, would you have bought it before? You must suffer to be happy. Who's going to buy that? Huh?
Don't worry about stuff.
What?
Be surprised. You might surprise yourself.
I can see it now. Ooh, yeah, I want that book. Give me that book. Oh, yeah. Happiness is for Masochists. By Hayes Motes. No, that really stops me. And I don't think you can write a good book about happiness unless you're up front with people that it's not a feeling. Of course, that blows people's minds right there. It's not an emotion. When people go to self-help, they want to feel good. When you take the pulse of a person in front of the self-help section, they're just like a person in front of the diet section. They're looking for another way to escape discipline. Looking for another way to escape doing the hard work of whether it's losing weight or getting your life together. There are no shortcuts to either. So what it really comes down to is whether we follow Sisyphus or Christ. Sisyphus or Christ. Now, Sisyphus, as I told you, is that character in Greek mythology who every day rolls the rock up the mountain, tries to place it on the top of the mountain, only to see it roll back again. And so he goes down, he rolls it up again. That's his life. Now there's a funny thing about the myth of Sisyphus. And that is that when the very, very fine French philosopher Albert Camus wrote his book called The Myth of Sisyphus. How many of you have ever heard of that book? The Myth of Sisyphus. How many have ever read that book? All right. The last line of the book is this, and you're going to be shocked. Camus wrote, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." And there's that imagination thing, Bob. And this I'm actually supporting your point here. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Now remember that Camus was an atheist, although he wrote his dissertation on St. Augustine and the idea of happiness, interestingly enough. And he was an existentialist, but a deeply morally committed man. Of that generation, the one that I think we admire the most, and the one whose books are worth reading, unlike Sartre, who's a fraud, in my opinion. There's two words there, must and happy. We must, and three, imagine. Why do we have to imagine happiness when we know what real happiness is? That's the difference. Christ or Sisyphus? What Camus is saying there is we have to give meaning to our existence because it isn't there. We must imagine Sisyphus happy or we will just commit suicide. fact, that's what that book is about. He opens the book as, why should I not commit suicide? I mean, that gets the freshman juices flowing. It's a good book for, for the young Hamlet-like Kyle, To be or not to be. Suffer arrows. Oh, I remember it well. I wore a lot of black in those days. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Because if Sisyphus isn't happy, then there's no need to avoid suicide, no reason to keep on living. So we have to imagine it, and this is why Bob Carlson's right, that imagination as the final step of asserting value is not enough to anchor a life. A life should be anchored in true knowledge or true revelation, not imaginative representations of it. And for Camus to say must meant that we're just going to assert a meaning to the universe that does not actually belong to it. Why? Because for some reason, we have an impulse to live and not to die. What Camus refused to recognize, because he rejected the faith of his country, the faith of his family. Imagine Camus as a Christian philosopher in his generation. What a powerhouse he would have been. That he didn't realize that this infinite desire that made him assert that Sisyphus must be happy, that led him to assert that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. This infinite desire has both a source and an end. That it is nature calling us to the source of our existence. So often we see in the works of unbelievers the yearning for God. Why? Because they've got it. In Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, the yearning for God is seen in the fact that they're waiting, and they don't stop waiting. It's a hilarious play. My wife actually starred in the first all-female performance of that in Washington in the the late 70s, early 80s. And so many people don't understand where the desire comes from. And so they either imagine absurd things as happy, or they wait and never act because they don't know what to do. And as the two bums in Beckett's play, what do they spend their time doing? Wasting time, kidding around, joking, uttering obscenities. They end up in violence just because they're bored. They suffer, French say, ennui, because they're just bored. They don't know what to do with their lives. I want to end this session and the last of these lectures with not a quote from Aquinas, not a quote from Camus, not a quote from John Stuart Mill, but a quote from St. Augustine, since St. Augustine seems to be the patron saint, next to Newman, who's not a saint yet, of our Wyoming School of Theology. I love the happy life, but I fear to find it in your abode, O Lord. I love the happy life, but I fear to find it in your abode, O Lord. We all admit we desire to find peace and rest and complete satisfaction, but why do we fear to find it with God? Because we don't want to give up We don't want to give up on being the measure of our own existence. We don't want anyone to place boundaries on what we can and cannot do to seek our happiness. We want to take our desire and do with it as we please. In other words, we want to imitate Lucifer's fall from heaven. How do we overcome that fear? I think the only way we can overcome that fear is, as Mitch and others have been suggesting, and that is by keeping our eye trained on the love of God and His grace. Because if we keep our eye trained there, and of course that's a matter of prayer and worship and a matter of study, but if we keep our eye on Him, we realize that all of these false pursuits, these ersatz efforts that have been discussed, that they really end up backfiring on us. They really end up creating misery where we expected joy. They end up creating loss where we expected gain. They end up with isolation where we expected love and family. So what I hope you will do, as I will do with these days we've spent together, is wherever and whenever you hear somebody using and abusing the term happiness, you say, no! Stop! That is not what happiness, that is not what the happy life is. And stop using the word happiness to justify your attempt to define your own existence and find satisfaction on your own terms. You know what? Because it's going to end up in a train wreck. Thank you very much.